For 5 years, Egypt has been governed by President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, and early this year he won his second term for presidential elections with 97% of the vote. The sham elections were criticised as being a one-man show with no credible opposition, and at least 6 other candidates were forced to pull out, prosecuted or jailed. I'm Kasim, this is KJ Vids, and in this video we will look at how the Egyptian president is destroying the nation. Egyptian society under the rule of Hosni Mubarak was well known to be highly militarized and policed. Basic civil liberties were suppressed and political opponents were arrested. Despite the Arab Spring, under Sisi the situation has gone far worse. Egyptians continue to experience increased suppression of rights and civil liberties. International human rights organizations document the widespread arrest of political opponents, particularly against the Muslim Brotherhood. Routine torture, forced disappearances, extrajudicial killings, arbitrary arrests and detentions, among other issues. Early on during Sisi's rule, Egyptian security forces and the army conducted what was called the worst state-organized mass killing of protesters in recent history by Human Rights Watch, systematically killing nearly 1,000 protesters who were opposing Morsi's ousting in August 2013. Other reports detail the widespread violation of the right to due process, including the use of mass trials, mass death sentences and extended perpetual detentions. This can also be seen in the use of military rather than civilian courts. In his most recent move, Sisi introduced a new law that tightens the government's control of the internet. Economically, over the last 2 decades, inflation in Egypt has seen some highs and lows. Since the military coup in 2013 and the election of President el-Sisi in 2014, inflation has increased from about 12% to its peak at around 33% in mid-2017. Sisi's signature economic achievement so far has been concluding a 3-year deal with the International Monetary Fund in 2016, hardly a success. But instead of improvements, many Egyptians continue to struggle or are even worse off. Since the IMF loan, the government has raised the price of subsidized fuel, increased value-added tax to 14% and devalued the Egyptian pound against the dollar by more than half, which has severely affected people in the import-reliant country. The poverty rate is estimated by some analysts to have risen from 27.8% to 35% of the population. 93 million people now live under the poverty line according to official figures. Meanwhile, with population growth of 2.4% per year, an education system that fails to deliver even basic literacy, and official youth unemployment of 25%, the structural issues facing the country are profound. The country needs to produce close to 1 million jobs per year just to meet the needs of new entrants. Many investors and economists also worry that the army is becoming too involved in the economy, threatening to crowd out private investors. Although estimates of what percentage of the economy is controlled by the military vary greatly, the military is clearly a predatory economic actor that is significantly and painfully distorting the national economy. Military companies hold a clear advantage in winning public contracts and are of great concern to large parts of Egypt's business community and to international investors. The Egyptian military has been a key economic actor in Egypt since the 1950s, although it has a hand in almost every sector from infrastructure to food to real estate. Its economic share is officially unknown. It's 1 to 2% according to Sisi, but estimates go up to over 60%. Egypt has a long history of receiving aid from foreign countries, the most well-known being the US. Washington supplies Cairo with nearly $1.3 billion in military aid and $200 million in economic assistance annually. Most recently, Egypt's Gulf neighbours, the UAE and Saudi Arabia, are using aid as a foreign policy tool to wield influence in the country. Soon after the 2013 coup, the UAE transferred $3 billion to Egypt and Saudi Arabia offered $5 billion, including a $2 billion central bank deposit, $2 billion in energy products and $1 billion in cash. By early 2015, Egypt had received $23 billion in aid from Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates and Kuwait. The Gulf countries have more say in what happens in the country than the Egyptians themselves. An example of this was Cairo's ceding of 2 islands in the Red Sea to Saudi Arabia, a move met with intense objections by Egyptians who saw this as a ceding of the sovereignty of Egyptian lands. Similarly, in 2016, Sisi issued an amendment to a law that forbade non-Egyptians from owning land in the Sinai Peninsula, so that Bahraini King Hamad bin Isa al Khalifa could have the same property rights as Egyptians with regards to the peninsula. The UAE government is also behind some of the mega projects in Egypt, including the construction of the new administrative capital and the building of a $3 billion industrial city at the Suez Canal, along with Saudi Arabia. It also extracts gold and invests in solar energy projects in the region of Halab, a resource-rich, strategic and disputed area on the Sudanese-Egyptian border. Increasing securitization and militarization of Egypt has helped entrench Sisi's power and position. In recent years, Egypt has engaged in military and security cooperation with the UAE, Saudi Arabia and even long-time regional so-called enemy Israel, all of which back the current military regime. The 2013 military coup was welcomed by Gulf monarchies like Saudi Arabia, who viewed the rise of civilian movements and parties like the Muslim Brotherhood during the Arab uprisings as threats to their dynastic rule. As such, Saudi Arabia and UAE were among the first countries to call the Muslim Brotherhood a terrorist organization after such a designation in Egypt. It is important to note that the Muslim Brotherhood is backed by Qatar, which was the target of a region-wide boycott in June 2017, led by Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Egypt also was a part of the boycott. This cooperation, including over Hamas and the Gaza Strip, is also in line with Saudi Arabia and Israel's efforts to curb growing Iranian influence in the region. The main reason for this cooperation between Tel Aviv and Cairo is to keep the status quo in the region, according to Nouman Telki, a foreign policy researcher at the Sita Foundation. What I mean with this is, first, the continuation of the Egyptian military regime, second, eliminating threats towards the security of Israel, and third, promoting US interests in the region. The reverberations of such policies were felt in Egypt as well as the region. The New York Times revealed in February that the Israeli army had been carrying out covert airstrikes on the Sinai Peninsula, numbering more than 100 for more than 2 years, with the approval of the Egyptian government. Bloomberg also reported in 2016 that Israel had been conducting drone strikes in the Sinai for a few years with Egypt's permission. Sisi has completely sold out Egypt on the most sensitive issues. When US President Donald Trump declared Jerusalem the capital of Israel, Cairo gave a statement countering such a policy. But the day after, leaked tapes revealed that Egyptian authorities had tacitly accepted the decision. In July 2018, the US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo lifted restrictions on $195 million in military aid that was frozen last year to protest Egypt's dire human rights record. Human rights groups slammed Mr. Pompeo's decision, saying he had squandered valuable leverage over President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi at a time when his human rights record seemed to be only getting worse. Repression is breeding resentment and in some cases radicalization, said Brian Dooley of Human Rights, that will ultimately further destabilize Egypt and undermine American interests. Egyptian officials were shocked at the rebuke from the United States, which over the past 40 years has given Egypt $47 billion in military aid and $24 billion in economic assistance. Mr. Rex Tillerson was said to be angry at the time that Mr. Sisi had broken a private promise made in Washington that he would not sign the harsh law on aid agency regulations. In May 2017, Mr. Sisi went ahead and enacted the law anyway, but in the end Sisi has been able to continue his tyrannical policies and get American funds. Analysts say that Sisi's second term will see constitutional changes that will expand his powers. Mamdouh Munir, director of the International Institute for Political Science, believes that Sisi will focus on consolidating his rule before trying to improve the country in order to eliminate all dissent within the state. In 2014, the constitution was changed to limit the president's power following the military-backed removal of power against then-President Mohamed Morsi a year earlier. The amendment stipulated that a prime minister elected by the parliament will share some powers and responsibilities with the president. But now Sisi is on a mission to amend this until he has full control of the executive branch. This will give him absolute powers similar to how it was during President Hosni Mubarak's time. Sisi's strategy is to stay in power at all costs, even if the people reject him, Munir said. Sadly, irrespective of the desire for political change expressed by the Egyptian population during the Arab Spring, 7 years later Egypt remains suffocated with disastrous economic policies, brutal dictatorship, and the selling out of its sovereignty to regional and international powers. The country is likely to remain fractured for many years to come, unless the people miraculously are able to create political change, starting with the change of leadership. Thanks for watching another KJ video. We would love to hear your views on the situation in the comments below. If you would like to see more videos like this, please help us by supporting our crowdfunding campaign on fundmypage.com/KJVids.